A mummified human hand once hidden inside a wall said to freeze victims in their sleep. Jars of preserved organs leaking fumes in a museum that smells faintly of chemicals and death. And a natural history exhibit sealed off because every animal inside turned out to be coated in poison. These are museums that contain items too dangerous to display. At the Whitby Museum in England, there's a shriveled, mummified hand kept under glass. It's what's called a Hand of Glory, a legendary object made from a severed hand. Supposedly, back in medieval times, thieves would make these from the hands of executed criminals. The idea was you'd light the fingers like candles, and supposedly everyone in the house would stay frozen asleep while you rob them blind. Sounds ridiculous, but people believed it enough to actually make these things. The one in Whitby was found in 1935, hidden inside a wall of a cottage in Yorkshire. When they examined it, scientists confirmed that it was human. Doesn't really take a scientist to confirm that, though. Just look at it. It is eerily well preserved. What they don't know is how it was preserved, which makes it even creepier. Staff say people get uncomfortable around this thing. One curator mentioned it's the one item nobody wants to move when they're rearranging exhibits. Next up is Mütter Museum in Philadelphia. This place looks like an old library, very classy looking, but won't find shelves of old books here. This museum is macabre, to say the least. You've got jars of preserved organs, remains of conjoined twins, skulls with diseases and deformities. It is gnarly stuff, but it's also really fascinating. I'd check this place out for sure, but what most visitors don't think about is that a lot of this stuff is actually hazardous. Back in the 18 and early 1900s, medical specimens were preserved using whatever chemicals worked. Arsenic, mercury, formaldehyde. And those chemicals don't just evaporate. They're still in there, still active. During some renovations, they actually had to close sections of the museum off because fumes were leaking from old jars. Just being near certain exhibits required safety measures. And then there's the biological side. Some of the tissues came from people who died of infectious diseases back when medicine didn't fully understand how they were transmitted. So there's a real question of whether any of the biological material could still pose a risk. The museum's been pretty upfront about it. A lot of their collection isn't even on display because it's either too fragile or too dangerous. Delbridge Museum of Natural History in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. In 2023, this museum suddenly shut down. They locked the doors and sealed off the taxidermy wing. Turns out the taxidermied animals on display were dangerous, contaminated with arsenic and other poisons. See, back in the early 1900s, taxidermists would soak animals' hides in arsenic soap to keep bugs from eating them. It worked great. Problem is, a century later, you've got displays that are basically toxic. The Great Plains Zoo, which sits right next to the museum, tested the collection and found that trying to clean or restore these things would just release carcinogenic dust into the air, so they made the call to just lock it all away and eventually dispose of it all. Nobody thought twice about standing right next to a mounted bison or elk. Kids probably touched the display cases. The whole time, there were harmful chemicals in the air. In Maryland, you'll find the National Museum of Health and Medicine. There are rows of shelves with preserved organs, deformities, amputated limbs, body parts from Civil War soldiers. Some of it's viewable, but a huge portion is locked away in storage, and there's a few reasons for that. First, a lot of these specimens are still sitting in their original 19th century preservation chemicals. Again, stuff that gives off harmful vapors if the seals break down. Staff work in ventilated areas with protective gear because just being around old jars can be a health risk. But there's also the ethical side. Some of the specimens were collected at a time where standards were not what they are today. Fetuses, body parts taken without proper consent. Museums are rethinking what should even be displayed anymore. But don't worry, there are still tons to see. Bits of human remains from autopsies, battlefield recoveries, and medical experiments. The Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. is one of the most famous museums in the world, but it also has some legitimately dangerous stuff tucked away in storage. Not what you'd think, either. It's old watches, airplane instrument panels, lab equipment. Thing is, it's all coated in radium paint. In the early 1900s, radium was used all the time. It glowed in the dark, so they used it in clocks, gauges, some old medical tools. Nobody understood how deadly it was yet. Factory workers, mostly women who later became known as radium girls, would even lick their brushes to get a finer point while painting with radium. A lot of them got sick and died from radiation poisoning. Now, those same objects are sitting in lead-lined storage at the Smithsonian. The conservation team uses Geiger counters before handling anything. Some pieces are safe enough to display for short periods, but others are giving off radiation levels that just can't be near the public. There's also a stash of uranium glass and radium health products that were sold to people back in the day. Radioactive water, radium suppositories, all kinds of insane stuff marketed as cures. And yeah, early science was pretty reckless. We were playing with things we just didn't understand. So, at a lot of museums, deep in storage, there's stuff that could actually hurt you if it wasn't handled properly. This place looks charming when you first walk in. With its vintage wood cabinets and old medicine bottles, the aesthetic is perfect, so much so that people have weddings here. It's funny when you think about what's actually inside those bottles, though. The New Orleans Pharmacy Museum preserves 19th century apothecary history, which means they've got shelves full of legitimate poisons: arsenic, mercury chloride, laudanum, which is basically liquid opium that was sold over the counter. Some of the liquids in those bottles are original, like they've been sitting there since the 1800s. The museum keeps certain cabinets locked or sealed in glass because the powders have crystallized over time, and disturbing them could be dangerous. There's also a whole section on voodoo cures and love potions that were laced with narcotics. The museum is basically a preserved poison shop. One of the curators joked that if an old bottle broke, they'd have to evacuate the building, which I guess wasn't really technically a joke. At the British Museum in London, you'll find the unlucky mummy. It's not an actual mummy, it's a painted wooden coffin lid from an ancient Egyptian priestess who lived somewhere around 950 BCE. But for over 100 years, people have blamed it for deaths, accidents, financial ruin, all kinds of misfortune. This thing was even partially blamed for the sinking of the Titanic. It was first found in Thebes in the 1800s. Early collectors who owned it reported weird streaks of bad luck. Newspapers in 1890s London ran with it, turning the coffin lid into this cursed object. The museum eventually put it behind glass. Even now, though, some visitors refuse to take photos of it, afraid something will happen to them. Also in London is the Hunterian Museum, which had the skeleton of a man named Charles Byrne on display for over 200 years. Now, Charles Byrne was known as the Irish Giant. He was 7'7" and became a public spectacle in 18th century London. But before he died in 1783, he made it very clear that he did not want to be dissected or put on display. He was terrified of ending up in a museum. And they were like, screw that, we're putting you on display at a museum. The surgeon John Hunter bribed someone to get Byrne's body and had it preserved for his collection. And for 2 centuries, Byrne's skeleton stood behind glass, part of the museum's medical exhibit. Then in 2017, the museum finally decided to take it down. They said it was never theirs to display in the first place, and keeping it up, of course, violated Byrne's wishes. Byrne's skeleton is still in the collection for research purposes, but the public can't see it anymore. Is that the right call? I don't know. I think it was wrong right after he died, but I mean, it's been 200 years. Put that big sucker up, let people gawk. The Codex Gigas is massive, 3 feet tall, 165 pounds, bound in leather that's probably animal hide. It's one of the largest medieval manuscripts still around, and it's nicknamed the Devil's Bible because of this full-page illustration of Satan inside it. Legend goes that a monk wrote the entire thing in one night after making a pact with the devil to avoid execution. It's now kept in the National Library of Sweden under tight environmental controls. They barely handle the thing. Visitors can see it through glass or look at digital scans, but actually touching the book is limited to a handful of experts. Not only is the book a delicate artifact, but the inks and tanning agents used in the binding contain toxins that can damage skin. So, in a way, this supposedly cursed book sorta lives up to the legend. And of course, we gotta talk about the Warren Occult Museum. It's not open to the public anymore, but the collection is still there, and it's full of items from actual cases Ed and Lorraine Warren worked on. There's all sorts of stuff here. A cursed piano that supposedly plays by itself, haunted paintings, shrunken heads, vampire coffins, and of course, the most infamous item in the museum is Annabelle the doll. But she's not the creepy porcelain doll from the movies. The real Annabelle is just a Raggedy Ann doll. like the kind you'd find at a garage sale, which somehow makes it worse. Annabelle in the movies is just so over-the-top looking. But the doll's been sitting behind glass for decades with a sign that says positively do not open. The story goes that priests had to come in and bless the room regularly because stuff would happen whenever people disrespected the doll. The most repeated story is about a guy who kept knocking on the glass and laughing, making fun of Annabelle. Then he died in a motorcycle accident that same night on the way home. Lorraine Warren said they handled the doll like a loaded weapon. They wouldn't move it without saying prayers first. With all that said, I've been your host, James. I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.